get jumped by a felon, I wanted to share with you guys memoirs of a Tibetan diplomat titled Dorjiev. So, for those of you who don't know, Rinpoche, Agvan Dorjiev, was a student of the 13th Dalai Lama, His Holiness. And I did a series on the 13th Dalai Lama's journeys in Mongolia, and I wanted to further cover this person because I just found his biography translated and introduced by the brother of the 14th Dalai Lama in the 1990, March 14th, as well as this other guy named Dan Martin. I don't know who Dan Martin is, but he probably contributed to the publication of this work. And it was published by a Japanese academic journal. Like, all these efforts had to come together for the Dharma to come to me. So I feel very blessed that I have the chance to share with you guys via video. Okay, the story of my own acquaintance, writes TJ Norbu, former professor and the brother of the 14th Dalai Lama, with the history of Dorjiev is perhaps not irrelevant for assessing the impact he has had and continues to have on Tibetan society in general. While I was studying in Gomang College in Drepung Monastery between 1941 and 1946, I often heard Dorjiev's name in connection with the many endowments he made while studying there. To the assembly hall Dukhang of Gomang College, he donated many temple hangings and decorations, mostly made of Russian silk brocade, the grade of silk most valued by Tibetans. These temple hangings and decorations were frequently changed on holy days and in honor of special visitors. They included pillar coverings, usually made of silk or brocade in central Tibet, and of carpets in other parts of the country, temple banners, umbrella-like canopies, brocades hanging at the top of the pillars, and networks of cloth hanging from the roof at the edge of the central skylight and elsewhere. It was common knowledge that one set of especially fine temple decorations had been a gift of Dorjiev, and these hangings were much admired and only used on special occasions. Like today, Happy Indian Republic Day to all those in and outside of India. When Dorjiev stayed at Drepung, he lived in the Kalka residence, which, like the Kumbum residence where I stayed, belonged to the Samlo section. Next to the particular building called Chubao, where I stayed, was the residence of the Dzongchu Trichul incarnation. The latter building was called Zhongchu Monastery and formed a part of the Zhongchu section. Because we both attended Gomang College, had common interests, and were close in age, and just because we were neighbors, the Zhongchu Trichul and I became good friends. Every day we walked together, and soon I found out that his previous incarnation had lived together with Dorjiev at Drepung, and for a time they had shared all their expenses and belongings. Therefore, several objects which Dorjiev had brought from abroad had found their way into his possession, since they formed a part of the property of the Zhongchu Lama resident Labrang, left by his predecessor. Among those objects which he kept in his room, I recall some clocks, snuff bottles, and a colorful Russian brocade monk's shirt. Later on, I studied with a famous scholar from Bratia, which is where Dorjiev is from, the Geshe Nawal Nima, who had formerly been a student of Dorjiev. The Geshe had stayed with Dondrup Larampa, the same as the Thuptim Domtrup, who would later ask Dorjiev to write his memoirs at Sholotai Monastery while attending a Russian school. Nawal Nima was ordained as a monk by Dorjiev, a frequent visitor to Sholotai Monastery. He was one of the 9 young Buryat monks selected by Dorjiev to go for advanced studies in the large monastic universities of Lhasa. Often, before and after the study periods I had with him, the Geshe expressed his gratefulness to the Sokpo Shamjab, as he referred to Dorjiev, and told stories about him. Still later, in my dealings with Tibetan officials, Dorjiev's name was often brought up, especially as a model of devoted service to the 13th Dalai Lama, His Holiness, in connection with events surrounding the Young Husband expedition and in his role during the period of the Dalai Lama's subsequent wanderings in Mongolia and China. For example, it was said that in debates held between local Mongolian monks, scholars, and Tibetan monks in the entourage accompanying the Dalai Lama in Urga, the Tibetan monks were clearly in danger of losing. When it came to Dorjiev's turn, he quickly turned it around, and the Tibetan team side quickly recovered. This was considered such an important point of Tibetan prestige that upon his return to Tibet, the Dalai Lama stiffened the academic requirements for advanced degrees. When I came out of Tibet, like other Tibetans, I was surprised to find that the rest of the world perceived Dorjiev as a Russian agent. To Tibetans, there has never been any question that he had worked entirely in the interests of the Dalai Lama and of Tibet in general. Even in his later years in Russia, he was still working for the interests of the Dalai Lama and of Tibetan-style Buddhist Kalmuks and Buryats, himself keeping disassociated as was possible from the internal politics, both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary, then prevailing in Russia. In the first decades of this century, he was simply searching for pragmatic solutions to British and Manchu political pressures on Tibet. His main idea was to use Tsarist Russian connections to counterbalance the immediate threats of Manchu and British imperialistic designs. I would argue that the following quotes most closely reflect British and Chinese fears about Dorjiev than the real Dorjiev. Quote, "The Russian Lama Dorjiev is said to have urged the present Grand Dalai Lama, His Holiness, to accept the Tsar as suzerain on the pretext that the Russian emperor was a reflex from the fabled paradise in the West. On his escape from Chinese influence, the unlucky young Dalai Lama soon fell deeply into Russian clutches through the influence of his favorite tutor, the Lama Dorjiev. This Lama is a Mongolian Buryat. Latterly, he has been in charge of the arsenal at Lhasa. On getting the ear of the young Dalai Lama, he poisoned his mind against the English and induced him to believe that the White Tsar is his friend and not England. Agvan Dorjiev is well known to the Foreign Department of the Government of India as Dorjiev, an active agent of Russian policy in Asia. A sinister character called Dorjiev, said to be a Russian Mongolian in the Lama's employ, was reported to be toing and froing between Lhasa and Moscow." And another quote, back to Mr. Dr. Norbu's account, "A close and critical reading of such statements, when compared to the memoirs and other sources available to us, will prove that much that has been said about Dorjiev, particularly about his imputed motives, is untrue or only half true. Dorjiev, whatever else he might have been, was a sincere believer in Buddhism. If British and Manchu or Chinese writers have implied otherwise, it should be remembered that the British and Manchus themselves were trying to send and actually sent spies and informants into Tibet under the guise of religious pilgrims and students. By the process of psychological projection, they assumed that Dorjiev was the same sort of pretend Buddhist puppet of Tsarist imperialism, one who had through flattery and intrigue managed to wiggle his way into a position of influence that they themselves wished they could have had working for their own respective imperialist interests. Indeed, it was the strength of his religious commitments that helped him turn to politics, not as a means to his own aggrandizement or for the greater glory of Russia, but because he perceived perhaps more clearly than many of his native-born Tibetan compatriots how strong were the external political pressures that threatened Tibetan Buddhism and even the Tibetan way of life, which was, it must be remembered, his own way of life. Having heard so many different stories and conflicting opinions about Dorjiev, I was always looking for more information. While in Mongolia in 1979, I heard that an autobiography by Dorjiev existed. I looked through libraries of Tibetan books in Ulaanbaatar, formerly known as Urga, and still later in Leningrad and Ulan-Ude. I always inquired about this and other works by Dorjiev. Everyone I asked knew the memoirs existed, and some had even seen it in its Mongolian version. I eventually met a Mongolian in Buryatia who had read it a few years previously and could describe its contents. Finally, in the summer of 1984, I visited a monastery in Buryatia and upon asking about Dorjiev's autobiography, was told that a copy could be procured. 2 days later, I was presented with two copies, one a Tibetan manuscript and the other an old Mongolian script lithograph. On a second trip to the Soviet Union, I received three further versions, one in Cyrillic script Mongolian, one typescript version in Russian, and also an old manuscript in Mongolian script. During my first trip to Leningrad in 1979, I visited Dorjiev's three-story Tibetan temple there. This astonishingly authentic Tibetan temple is now surrounded by ordinary apartment buildings. I was deeply impressed to find a bit of Tibet in surroundings otherwise so alien to it, but I was impressed still more by the character of the man who had had the courage to put it there. Sadly, the doors of the temple were locked. T.J. Norbu. So I saw a vlog by a Russian person, Mr. Igor, and he also visited, and it seemed to be running with incense and stuff. So you guys can check out this vlog if you want to see this cool Tibetan temple in modern day St. Petersburg. I thought more people knew about him, but I asked my Tibetan friend who lives in Miklotganj, the seat of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, and he didn't know about Mr. Dorjiev Rinpoche. And during my discussion with my friend, I realized that there is a Chinese journalist who wrote a book about his views on Tibet while working as a journalist covering Tibet for Chinese state media. And to my and my friend's astonishment, this book is banned in mainland China. So this is why we need to promote freedom of speech within certain spaces in developing countries as well as developed countries, because in China, you cannot even have state media journalists writing about Tibet. So, like this guy, he definitely was towing the line when he was writing about a lot of his views. He definitely did not advocate for independence of Tibet. In fact, he even went on to proclaim that Tibetans have a different psychological profile than Han Chinese people and all these ideas where he got from covering Tibet. However, his book is still not allowed to be published inside mainland China. And I think a lot of people don't realize the extent of censorship that goes on in China, especially in regards to ethnic minorities / sovereign people like the Tibetans or Uyghurs. Check out this autobiography by Dorjiev if you have the time, and see you guys in the next BookTube video.